Hey you guys, so welcome into She's Created Godly. I want to do a quick recap of what we've been talking about the past couple of weeks, just with our relationship with God and getting back to the relationship that matters the most in our life, and how this relationship can push us into a positive dynamic in the other relationships we have in our lives, whether it's our romantic relationships, it is our friendships, our partnerships with work, community, and relatives, just how we can overall be a better person within a relationship. So I talked about just the importance of having a relationship with God, where that starts and how that looks. Then last week I left off with the food for thought of, are we doing what we're supposed to do in our relationship with God? Are we holding up our end of the bargain when it comes to the demands of the relationship that God has for us? Because God is going to always hold up his end, but it's up to us if we can attest to what we do that meets up to his standard. So one thing it requires is intimacy. So how do we get intimacy with God, being that he is not a human person that can stand beside us, hug us, kiss us, hold our hand, speak and reaffirm us in the physical sense? Okay, so one that I'm going to tap into today is prayer. Well, many people are like, oh, praying, I gotta pray. First, let me go ahead and take away the negative stigma that is attached to prayer. There is no certain way that you should pray other than the will of the Father. That's it. It's okay if you don't speak in tongues. It is okay if your prayer is not an hour, because the Bible talks about not to just fill up our prayers with useless words, but to really get to the nitty gritty. For one, when we communicate with God, we need to be honest with how we feel. So prayer is communication. It is our conversation with God. Asking questions, that's praying. Seeking his face, that is praying. When you ask God for something, one thing you should do is wait for a response. That's communication, that's conversation. Just as much as we speak to God, we should listen. And that's why the Bible tells us to be slow to speak and swift to hear, so that we can really hear what God is saying. Because if we stop once we get done praying and we just go back to our everyday lives and we feel like that's the end of the conversation, we will never hear what he has to say. So how can we grow with him if we don't communicate with him? Because if you're talking to somebody, you're going to want to talk to them every day and throughout the day. That's the same way God is. You don't have to just pray one time a day. You don't have to converse with God twice a day, when you wake up and when you go to bed. He is available all day long. He wants to hear from you all day long. So what do we do? What do we do on our parts? Well, we initiate conversation with him. Father, Jesus, Abba, Jehovah. We initiate and we get his attention by calling his name. So there are ways that if you really don't know how to pray, or you don't know how to start your conversation with God, start by thanking him for the things that you have, the things that didn't happen to you, the things that could have happened and God planned an escape for you. Praising him, giving him adoration and glory and adoring his name, loving on him. That's a level of intimacy. Just like we as humans, we want reassurance. Sometimes God does too, not because it boosts his ego, but because it reminds him that we know who he is and we trust who he is. We know him to be this, and that's why we give him glory. That's why we commune with him, and that's why we give him honor. So when we converse with God, there are some things that we need to take into play. There are some things that we need to remember. Do we take the time to hear his response, or do we end the conversation? Just like when you get in an argument with somebody, do you end it after you say your point, or do you listen for their maybe rebuttal, for their response? Do you give God time to respond to you? That will determine the level of intimacy you have with him. The less you let him speak, the less intimacy, the less fire, the less passion you will have in your relationship with him. It won't seem as significant because you're not getting a response. Or when he speaks, do you shut him down? Because let's just be honest, sometimes God responds and he says things that we don't necessarily agree with, or we don't want to hear right now. And that's how it is even in a relationship. That person is going to say something you don't necessarily agree with, or you don't think is true, or you don't want to hear, but you got to hear it anyway. That's the same way with God. But it's better to hear him than to hear and reject him. Because one thing about it, if you hear what he says and you reject it, now you're in the spirit of rebellion and disobedience, which furthermore puts a dent in your relationship with him. Okay, so also in your conversation, what voice do you hear? How does he speak to you? Because also we got to understand God speaks to us differently. So this voice that you hear, before I get into how he speaks to us, let's talk about the voice that you hear. Because there are different voices. There is the voice of God. There's the voice of the enemy. There's the voice of our conscience. There's the voice of our flesh. And there's another voice I can't remember, but I'll get back to that. But does the voice that you hear, does it gratify your flesh? When you get done praying, or when you get done communing, or even when you're going about your everyday life and you're doing tasks, does that voice speak and gratify your flesh? Does your thoughts gratify your flesh? And what do I mean by gratify your flesh? Does it lead you to sin? Gratify our flesh. The spirit against the flesh is going to always be at war. And it's in your Bible. It's going to always be at war. The light cannot exist where darkness is, and darkness cannot exist where light is. We have to choose one. So if that thought, let's just say that thought is, I don't need to pray today because I got life figured out. That gratified your flesh. If you're thinking on lustful things or sexual immorality, that gratifies your flesh. It pleases you for the moment, but it gratifies the flesh. It exalts the flesh. It builds up the flesh. So if you hear something that leads you into the things of your sinful nature, which is your flesh, it gratifies it. So the voice that you hear, does it convict you? Because let's just be honest, everything that God says isn't always peachy creamy and lovey-dovey. Some things are going to sting. Some things are going to hurt. Some things are going to be like, geez, Lord, like you just put the mirror on me. I ain't think nobody knew that, but he does. So, or do we tell God what to say? Because I know a lot of people take that thing out of context about giving God a password. Supposedly, it's in Genesis 24, where the servants prayed and asked God. And if you read it, because I need y'all to read, it says, before he could finish praying, God heard and answered him. Be ye not deceived. Always read. And that's King James. Read King James. Be ye not deceived. That's all I'm saying. So do we tell God what to say? Like, do we listen for what we want to hear? Like, seriously, do we listen for what we want to hear? Like, I know a lot of people, they want a spouse. So every time you pray, you hear God talking about a spouse. Or every time you pray, you hear God saying, you about to get a new car. I'm about to make you rich. But you never hear God telling you, you need to go forgive this person. You never hear God telling you to give up your ways. You never hear God telling you he wants more time with you. Or I need you to let this go. if you never hear those things, might want to reevaluate who you are listening to. Because don't get me wrong, God is a God of prosperity, but he is also the God of wisdom. He's the God of knowledge. He's the God of peace, and he's the God of long suffering, which he is also a God that requires obedience and reverence, which means if we are going to be in his likeness and in his image, we must follow behind him. So you know what that means? We have to communicate as he communicates. And we have to be held accountable when he holds us accountable. So we got to listen. When it comes to God, we have to listen, not just for the good things, but for the correction, which is protection, for the chastisement, which is done in love. Because it says in our word that he chastened those whom he loved. So if God ain't correcting you, you should be worried. You should definitely be worried. There's really no way around it. You should definitely be worried. So another thing to think about is, do we receive what God says even if we don't agree with it? Do we sit and listen when God says, I know that you want this apartment, but I want you to go here? And you're like, God, I don't understand why. Do we need God to explain his plans to us? Do we need a step-by-step play as to why God came out with this decision, or why God told us to do this? Or is our faith in God enough? Is the conviction that God is who he said he is enough for us? You know, it's just thoughts, because in order to create this intimacy, we got to spend time and we got to converse with him. But also, I have to be realistic with you. I have to let you know that God is not going to tell you everything you want to hear. If anything, most of the time it's going to contradict what you want to hear. When you say, God, make me more like you, he going to start putting that mirror on you and showing you what is not like him, what needs to be removed, what you need to increase. Because if you're not a loving person, you best believe he's going to tell you. And he's going to show you how to be a loving person. He's not going to point out your weaknesses to insult you and to embarrass you and humiliate you. He's going to point these things out so that he can strengthen you, so that he can build you up in your most holy faith, so that you can contend to the faith, so that when every weapon comes against you, for one, it's not going to prosper, but that you can withstand. That is what he wants us to do. He keeps saying it multiple times in his word, so that we can endure. We can be not dismayed and be not deceived and be not troubled, because there are going to be many people that's going to tell you, thus saith the Lord. But it's not even thus saith the Lord. But if you don't commune with him and talk with him, you won't know at all. So are you okay with God saying something that you don't agree with? Are you okay with that? Can you literally sit here and say, you know what, God, I don't agree with that. You know what, God, I don't understand this. God, this does not make sense to me, but I trust you. And because you said it, you got to fulfill it. But what is my obligation? What do you need me to do? Because they talk about faith without works is dead, but the works is not just doing things that we feel. Like if you want a new place, going out and looking, that's not the works that he is talking about. What is the task that he gave you to be obedient to open that door? That is what the work is. The level of obedience. How long it takes you to respond. Do you fill out the task to completion, or do you do what feels comfortable for you? All right. So next thought. Are you okay with silence? Are you okay when God gets quiet? That's literally a question that I had to deal with at one point in time. Am I okay with God being silent? Because sometimes he does not speak all the time. There are some seasons that we go through where it feels like, Lord, if you could just say something. Yay or nay, cat, dog, frog, blue, purple, green. Like, Lord, I need you to say something. I'm crying out. I need you to say something. And he's quiet. Can you handle that in your relationship with him? Can you handle asking him a question and he says no? Can you handle him just not responding? You're like, Lord, I need to know what to do. I need to know what to do. I need to know what to do. And he's like, crickets. Can you handle it? Are you going to get bent out of shape? Are you going to start lacking in your faith and in your trust in God, believing that he's not good just because he's not responding when you want? Because let's just be honest. Let's go ahead and put it out there on the table. I want you to be honest. I want to be honest with y'all. God does not always respond right when we want him to. There are some days I get done praying and I'm sitting. I remember one day I sat for an hour and I'm like, you ain't gonna say nothing? Like, I'm just being honest with you. I'm like, Lord, you ain't gonna say nothing? You just gonna leave me out here? You don't wanna say nothing? Nope, he ain't say nothing. I kid you not. It wasn't until 3 o'clock the next morning when the Lord had an earful to say to me. And that's just him really trying to see if we really in this thing for the long haul. Like, are we really committed to him, that we are willing to wait on him? Because let's just be honest, waiting isn't always, oh, I'm waiting for God to give me a new house. Sometimes waiting is just to hear his voice. Because let's just be honest, he's there, he's present, but he has to really see. Because if he always gives us microwave responses right then and there, we build no endurance. We build no endurance to stay in the relationship. We build no persistence. We stop seeking at that point. He's like, no, I want to see how long you going to seek. I want to see if you're going to be persistent in knocking. Everything ties back into, like, literally, who are we rooted in? Are we really satisfied in our relationship with him? But are we satisfied because he does everything we want him to? Or are we satisfied because we know God is being God to us? Whew. All right, so my last thought. Are you willing to learn all the ways that God speaks to you? Which goes back to something I said earlier. God does not always speak to us the same way. Sometimes God speaks with the voice in our thoughts. Sometimes God speaks through dreams. Sometimes God speaks just through the supernatural. He will do things to cause visions and signs. He will do things like, some people, they may hear rain. Some people, they may dream about a flood. Some people, God is just going to speak to inevitably. And then some people, they're going to experience the presence. God is going to usher them into a different place. But are you ready for when God, because sometimes God will just use one word. You may be going somewhere and you see one word flash in front of your eye. You're like, God's like, I just spoke to you. Or just, are you ready? But how do you tie this all together? How do you even know if God is even speaking to you? How do you know if God is answering you? How do you know that God is showing you these things? Through his word. You have to spend time in his word. Just like we take time to get to know people, we got to take time to get to know him. How? Through his word. Reading the Bible, that's how God speaks to us. Through his word. If you hear something and you can back it up in that word, you've heard from God. That is your confirmation that you heard from God, that it aligns with his word. And if you haven't spent time, it's probably harder for you to really understand the voice of God, because the voice of God does not yell. He's not aggressive. He's a gentleman, and he speaks softly to us. Even in the chastisement, it's like, oh God, that stung. Who it stung. But then you start to realize the more you commune with him, the more you start to think like him, on point. Like, the more the Holy Spirit will be like, you already knew you was wrong. I'd be like, okay, you're right. Like, you know, the more, it's like, you know how the more you spend time with somebody, the more you pick up their habits. That's the same way with God. We start to commune like him. We start to converse like him, even with other people, that we start to speak to them as God speaks to them. And even sometimes God's going to use us to speak to other people. But we just have to be in a position where we keep an open line of communication with him. I hope this helped. Stay tuned for next week. We're going to talk about the worship aspect of intimacy with God. And after worship, we're going to dwindle down into a few more aspects. And then we're going to go on to a different part of our relationship with God. Stay tuned.